Good evening. Welcome once again to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries here in Latonia, Kentucky, in case anyone's confused about where we're from. It's again, we're in February now, February the 6th we're recording this, and I think I'm going to, sorry, 5th, it's the 5th, that's right, yeah. The reason I'm telling you that is because sometimes it makes it easier for people to go back and identify the particular week or the program on our website that you want to find. You can, well, it's the one about so-and-so, but if you know the date, because they're all dated, and you can find it out from there. Plus the fact it gives you an idea of how far ahead sometimes we do record these. The unfortunate thing about that is that there's a backside to that too. It's nice to get them recorded, get them, quote, in the can, so they're ready for the cable company. But it also means that if after I've done the program and I go through and look at it, or I go through my script and think, ooh, I should have said this or I should have said that, it's gone. I can't call it back. And then I have to remember to do a caveat the following week or whenever I find it. A couple of things I want to reiterate again for those of you who may have joined us recently, or maybe this is your first program. And we talked a lot about the various sources of the Bible in earlier programs. This is, I think, chapter 9. Yeah, chapter 9, that's right. We talked about the sources J and E and D, which is the Deuteronomy source. And I want you to know that I haven't gone too much into the details of how they picked all this out. That's something for some really intense Bible study and not really the scope of this program. As always, what we try to do in this program is to get you more interested in your Bible, both in reading it, both in understanding how it came to be and what it says to us. All right? So really in-depth, word for word, oh, this word didn't exist then, that word, that would probably bore you to tears and I'd be talking to dead air. Probably am in some cases anyway. But so if you say, well, how do we know about all these J and E and this sort of thing? There are some very scholarly treatises on these and a lot of documentation, which if you really want to get into, go on the internet. There are 50 million different sources from every point of view, Catholic, Protestant, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, whatever your particular choice of religion is, okay? So what we're trying to do is sketch in a picture here. Now, if you remember, we finished up last week with the Assyrians demolishing or attacking Jerusalem, and Hezekiah and his son, Hezekiah was ruling at the time. And if you remember the Bible, Kings, Isaiah, Chronicles, give you this story about how during the night an angel of the Lord came upon the Assyrians and 180-something thousand of them died, and so they went away with their tails between their legs and didn't actually capture Jerusalem. If you go to what is called the Nineveh Prism, which is a big, almost like a pyramid-shaped thing they've discovered in that part of the world, on there is an account of how Jerusalem was besieged and how they paid vast sums of money in gold and this sort of thing, and had to kowtow and all that business to stop the city being sacked. Now, you pays your money, you takes your choice. The Assyrians could have been writing this wonderful inscription on the wall, and the whole sides of this prism are filled with descriptions of the battle, mentions Hezekiah and everybody else. That was the Assyrians' way of saying, hey, the spin, if you like, the wag of the dog thing, where we had a great victory. Nobody's going to tell you about it, but we will. And in Kings and Chronicles and things like that, maybe that's the Israelites' way of saying, hey, they pulled back. I don't know. Nobody seems to be able to put a finger on it, but there it is. Okay. But anyway, we're in a position where they're now sort of, under Assyrian vassalage. In other words, they've got their own king, but the Syrians are kind of in charge. Hezekiah's son, who took over, failed miserably. Okay. And the grandson followed the same thing. You can see that, you read that in Kings. The pagan gods were back in the temple. Now, we need to talk about that for a second. People get the impression that the Jews put pagan gods back in the temple. The minute something goes wrong, everyone forgets about God and they put the pagan gods back in the temple. Not necessarily so. It could well be that the conquering authority or the ruling authority says, hey, we're in charge. We want something that represents our authority in your temple. After all, the temple to the Jews was the same thing as our Constitution Hall or whatever, Houses of Parliament in England or whatever you want to call it. If you're a nation that's been ruled by another, usually the flag or some symbol of that nation is placed in the central, whatever it is. In the case of the Jews, they don't have a central legislative authority. It is the temple. So the pagan gods or images go back into the temple. And don't forget, any image, maybe it's just the image of the Assyrian leader or something, to the Jews that would be a pagan god. Okay? And as I say, maybe it was under pressure. Maybe they didn't have a lot of choice. They're conquered, do what you're told or else. So that's the position we're in, okay? And then things change. Here comes King Josiah. And I'm just going to briefly give you a little minute thing on this, and then we're going to go back and look at some history. Josiah comes, and according to Deuteronomy and Kings and all the others, he did good, okay? During his reign, he became a big influence. He got rid of the idols up in the hills and got everything turned around, started up the temple again. And in 622, a priest called Hilkiah found a scroll in the temple. They sent a chap called Sheba, his scribe, to Josiah and said, look what we found in the temple, a scroll. You know what a scroll is? Okay. So what was this book? What was it? And who was Hilkiah? More important. But before we get there, let's look at some important changes on the international scene, as it was then. First of all, the Assyrians have become a lot weaker, and their empire is starting to crumble at the edges. Right? As happens in history, as we've all seen it. Empires come and they flourish, and then they get too big for their britches, or they get too big to control, much like the Roman Empire, which was so big it couldn't literally handle itself, and then gradually crumbled around at the edges, and somebody else popped up. Somebody takes a bit of territory from that empire and says, oh, we got away with that, and they do a bit more. Okay, so the Assyrians, just north of Israel, they're crumbling. They're still there. They're still a force to be reckoned with, but some of the outlying countries are kind of crumbling, which is probably why Josiah got away with as much as he did. On the other hand, the Babylonian Empire, even further north, is starting to rise, starting to get very, very powerful, starting to conquer and expand from where it is. Two things to be watching there, okay? And I say this helped Josiah bring his reforms in because he wasn't being monitored so much as perhaps previously. I mean, he was perhaps a little more independent. So what happens is that when you've got problems at home, you don't worry too much about what's happening 300, 400, 500, 600 miles away in some little province called Judah. Let them get on with it. We've got other big problems to take care of. So Josiah, timing is everything, as they say. Josiah got this relief, if you will. He could start making these reforms. Now, the reforms he's making are really bringing Israel back to where they were before. No pagan gods, and when I say high places and things, I think you know what I mean, but for those who don't, it's, the little pagan altars up in the hills that you go and pray to and this sort of thing for good crops or a new baby boy or something like that. That sort of thing. That's what they're talking about. So this is going on. Josiah's trying to make his reforms. And the Assyrians, weaker now, have a pact with Egypt. Okay, Syrians are up here, Egypt's down here, Israel's in the middle. Okay, so the Assyrians and Egypt say, look, Babylon's getting too big for its britches. Let's join forces, and we'll take out Babylon, which was the sort of thing that happened in those days. Okay, the Egyptian army and the Assyrian army is probably too big for the Babylonian army. So Egypt has to get to Syria. Where are they going to go? They're going to come up through Judah. They're going to march up through Judah. Not a problem, because after all, Judah is a vassal country to the Assyrians. Shouldn't see a problem there, should we? Right. Okay. So Josiah, again, feeling a bit more independent, shall we say. The people say, hey, the Egyptians are marching up through the land. And so Josiah decides, wow, what an opportunity. We could wipe out the neighbour to the south. We couldn't fight the Assyrians and the Egyptians, but we could, if we knock out the Egyptians, that makes Syria less of a problem. So Josiah decides to attack the Egyptians. And the place he chooses is called Megiddo. And I think everybody's heard that name. There's umpteen movies being made about that battle. There's umpteen books being written about it. On the Bible study circuit, there are umpteen commentaries about it. But it's a battle. The Egyptians win, sort of. But what the bad thing about it is that Josiah is killed. This king, who did good by biblical standards, if you will, is killed. And that really is the point, the beginning of the end for Judah as a separate country. That point there. Josiah's killed. First of all, the reforms stop. Now, I don't know what was happening with the Israelites at that time, but it seems to me it doesn't take much for them to slip away from the true faith, if you will, and start going back to heathen worship. But that's what happened. It ends all the Josiah's reforms that he's been trying to do. Okay, so it's a major blow to Egypt. Okay, and in fact, in 22 years from Josiah's death, the kingdom of Judah will be gone, literally gone. Okay. As I say, Egypt appoints Jehoahaz as king. And if you read your Bible in Kings, okay, you will see he lasts 3 months. And so the Egyptians appoint another one, Jehoiakim, okay, and he lasts 11 years. And then what happens is that the Egyptians are still losing power, the Babylonians are still getting better, and now the Babylonians come down and take over as the authority, not taking away the state, but as the authority. So they appoint their king, Jehoiachin. He lasts 3 months. Seems to be a thing about these. I wouldn't be appointed king by a conquering nation. 3 months is about all you get. Okay. So then they appoint Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah lasts 11 years, which is, I guess a lifetime in those days. But so Zedekiah lasts 11 years. But during his time, things start falling apart. He doesn't maintain all the reforms that Josiah had started. Okay? And then during that time, I guess Josiah gets a bit carried away and decides to rebel against Babylon. Big mistake, because the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem. I mean, no two ways about it. They flatten it. Okay? And the last thing King Zedekiah sees, and you can read this in the Bible, is that they kill his sons in front of him and then blind him. So Zedekiah brings them almost to the brink. And at that point in time, you could say that the kingdom of Judah is no more. The Babylonians appoint a governor called Gedaliah. We'll get more into detail on these later. And he gets assassinated. So they assassinate the Babylonian appointed ruler, and literally most of the population flees to Egypt. Now, remember what I said earlier several times. We are not talking about millions of people here. We're talking about thousands of people. Egypt is just down the road from Israel, as you probably know, looking at your maps of the 6-Day War and whatever. So a whole bunch of Judah's inhabitants, the rest of the Jews, go to Egypt. And the rest of them, a whole bunch of them, like the leading lights, are all sent to captivity in Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar burns Jerusalem down, so it's knocked down. First thing, knock all the walls down, knock all the big buildings down. It's just a just a rubble-strewn mess. So not all the Israelites go into captivity, just the intelligentsia and the important people, and some unimportant people, I suppose, as well. The idea then, if you went into captivity, you could take your servants with you. Not good for the servants, but there you go. But a lot of the population fled to Egypt, went over the border to Egypt, where they weren't pursued. All Nebuchadnezzar wanted was nobody giving him a hard time. Okay? So by 587, it's all gone. Jerusalem is desolate. The inhabitants are either hiding in the hills. I'm sure there were a few farmers and people like that who stayed. There won't be any bother to the Babylonian forces. The rest of the population is fled to Egypt. Judah is basically a wasteland, sparsely populated. Okay? So remember that. Here's the nation whose God is the Lord, who've been promised the Holy Land, or the Promised Land, in perpetuity. God would always be with them, and now there's nothing. So with that in your mind, let's go back to Hilkiah and the book. In 622, the book that Hilkiah, the scroll that Hilkiah brought to Josiah, was Deuteronomy. Now, it's not a new idea that this was Deuteronomy. Jerome, one of the great early Christian theologians, agreed that yes, in all likelihood, the scroll that Hilkiah brought was the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, there's a modern scholar, Thomas Hobbes, is one of the first to subscribe to this idea, because what it means is that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. I mean, back in 1805, a gentleman called DeWitt said that Deuteronomy wasn't a Mosaic book. It couldn't have been written about that time. It's not an early manuscript. By early, I mean, back at the beginning of Israelites' history. It was written, so scholars believe, not long before it was discovered. And I use the word discovered advisedly, because as we shall see, it fits, how can I say this? The circumstances fit the availability. It's almost as though Deuteronomy was written to provide grounds for Josiah's reforms. So King Josiah is trying to reform, the religion, get people away from pagan worship, get people, back to the church, if you will. All right. If you look at the laws, Deuteronomy's got. We'll go into Deuteronomy in a bit more, but if you look at the laws in Deuteronomy, the Mosaic laws, the first law is you sacrifice only at the temple. There is a caveat there that if you're too far away, you can't get to it, you can sacrifice at home. And remember what I said about sacrifice wasn't just throwing a bunch of animals on the fire and burning them up for God. Sacrifice was part of the, you sacrificed animals to eat them, but you gave God a portion, you gave the priests a portion, and you kept the rest for yourself. So having to go to the temple every time you want to eat meat, a bit of a burden. So when Josiah first said it, I'm sure people said, I'm not going to do that. I said, it's 4 miles each way. I'm not going to do that. So they needed, Josiah and his reformists needed something to base that on. And Deuteronomy, the scroll, seems to hold that up. I mean, what it did also, something to consider, and when you read the Bible, you have to realize how human a document it is. It's about people. Okay, it's God's word to us, but it's written by people, it's about people. It brings all the influence of religion, and secondly, all the income for religion to Jerusalem. In other words, you don't want to drag a goat 5 miles to the sacrifice. You go to the temple, buy a goat, have it sacrificed, take it home for dinner. But you paid for it. Extrapolate that out to Jesus' time and you find all the moneylenders, they made a big business out of it. But even in those days, having all the worship in the temple, centralized the religion, gave a lot of power and a lot of influence to the temple priests. And it was a Jerusalem temple priest, Hilkiah, who found the book. Now what's interesting about this centralization is this. In Kings and Samuel, there's nothing about it. In fact, there's very little about it at all until Deuteronomy, until Josiah's time. Okay? So why then this big discovery that says, oh, we're supposed to go to the temple? Was it really old, from Moses' time, as the history would have you believe? That Deuteronomy was existing around the same time as the other old books? Or was it something that Josiah and Hilkiah planned to have happen? We need to justify what we're doing in the righteous sense of the word. Now, I'm not saying they were doing anything wrong, but they needed to have some support for it. So up pops this book. Oh, look what we found. We found a book of laws that says this is what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, let's look at what it contains. I mean, it's got Moses' farewell speech, okay, where he goes back over and says, look at all we've done. You know, he does a review of the past 40 years. You know, we went here, we did this, and we did this. He kind of, in fact, and I've said this before, I'll say it again. If you want to know the history of the Israelites, just read Deuteronomy, because it's all there. All the other books have got some details in them, but Moses' farewell speech would be the cliff notes for the Jewish history. There you go. If you want to bone up on Jewish history for an exam, read Deuteronomy, it's all there. He gives them this long, rambling, almost half the way through the book, review of everything they've done up till now. And by the way, they're in the plains of Moab at this time. Okay? Then he gives them a code of laws. Then he says, and here's some more laws for you. Now, bear in mind, up until that time, the only laws that the Jews were working on was the Ten Commandments. Now, here's Moses coming up with, additions, more laws, code of laws, okay, about behavior, about what you should do, how you should behave, and where the worship should be, and that sort of thing. That wasn't in the Ten Commandments at all. And it also nominates Joshua as a leader, which makes, kind of sense. Obviously, if you're going to die, you might put Joshua in, tell them so they're not fighting about the leadership. One of the interesting things about one of the other great religions that exists today is Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad died, there was an instant split between his followers about who should be the next leader, which is why you have Sunnis and Shiites. They split. Shiites believe that it has to be a descendant of the Prophet. Sunnis follow that it's an appointed thing. But either way, Moses didn't want that to happen, obviously, so he appoints Joshua. But you've got to notice, too, when you're reading Deuteronomy, there's a special relationship between Deuteronomy and the next 6 books. Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, which are sometimes called the early prophets, are like a long, continuous story that literally takes the reader on a journey through the history. It's a very strong literary union between all of these books. The language, writing, style, whatever, between all these books is too similar to be coincidental. It is plainly obvious that they were not just a collection of loose stories jammed together in some semblance of an order. They are carefully designed to work as each progresses, each one goes through, it's a logical progression. It's, as I say, it's not a loose connection of works. It's designed to tell a continuous story. And what it does, if you think about it, Deuteronomy, Moses, tells that the first 40 years up to coming into the Promised Land. Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel tell the story of what happened after that in a nice long story. Now, it's not one author. I'm not going to tell you one person wrote it because it's too long a period of time. It's not one author. It's various sections written by different people. It's fairly obvious. Some of it's the court history of David, some of it's Samuel, some of it's other sources. But one person put, and the style shows you this, is put together by one person who had to be a writer, first of all, and an editor. Somebody who knew how to put all the different stories so they run chronologically, which they do. You know, they go from here to here to here. It's a great piece of work. But so it flows from Deuteronomy right through those next 6 books. That it flows all the way through as a history of the Israelites in the land. So, who selected these stories and other texts? I mean, who sat down and made it their life's work to do this? They arranged them. They shortened some of them. They added comments to make things logical. There are even introductions at the beginning of each section so that it ties them all together. So you have to ask yourself, who constructed this history of Israel? And we've done that. We've asked ourselves, who constructed this history? And to find out, you're going to have to tune in next week because we've run out of time again. So look at those 5, 6 books with a new light, perhaps, if you have time to read them through. And I'll see you here next week, and we'll continue the story about who wrote the Bible. Good night and God bless you.